admitting people, so be patient. We'll be with you in a minute. I'm putting it live on Facebook, so bear with me while I just set that up. Okay, so we're live on Facebook. If you don't want to be live on Facebook, you need to remove your face from the screen. Yeah. Okay. So I've got to. Right. Okay, we're there. David, are you admitting people? Okay, so Campaign for Truth and Iron Anti-Semitism welcome you all to this meeting called Christianity, Antisemitism and Zionism. We're very pleased to have Tony Pearce, our speaker here tonight. Tony and Barbara from the Christian Fellowship in Temple Fortune are great friends of ours, and we hold many meetings at their facility at their church in London. So we're very happy to have Tony here. Campaign for Truth and Iron Antisemitism are activist groups that stand against anti-Semitism. We formed in about 2007, and we monitor anti-Semitism both on the streets and online, and we hold events very often at the church. So welcome everybody. I'm going to introduce Tony for those of you who don't know him. Tony Pearce. He worked for several years as a teacher, teaching at the Hendon Comprehensive School in London and the Hashmonean Boys' School in North London. In recent years, he has worked in Christian ministry, now serving as pastor at the Bridge Christian Fellowship in Temple Fortune in London. He has authored a number of books, including the book The Messiah Factor and Countdown to Calamity. He edits the quarterly magazine Light for the Last Days, concerning the current events and Bible prophecy. The magazine takes a pro-Israel line and regularly comments on events in the Middle East. It is translated into French, German, Spanish, and Romanian. Tony is married to Barbara, who also takes a keen interest in supporting Israel and combating anti-Semitism. They live in Finchley. Before Tony starts speaking, I just want to say to you that on your screen, you've got a chat box at the bottom. We're going to ask you all to put your questions there as you go along, type your questions in, and David up in the corner there is going to correlate them, and he's going to be asking questions, correlating similar questions and posing the questions to Tony. And from time to time, we'll invite certain people in to speak. I'm asking you please to keep your microphones on mute, and if you're invited to speak, to unmute yourself. So Tony, over to you. There you go. Unmute yourself.
Thank you, Sharon. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Good. Oh, well, it's very good to be with you all here. I came to the last meeting which Sharon and the friends put on, which Tuvia Tenenbaum spoke, and he spoke particularly about anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism we found in the UK. And Barbara and I were quite horrified to see how much anti-Semitism there was around, and also to learn that much of it was from, or some of it was from, a so-called Christian background. And I suggested to Sharon that I might give a talk trying to illustrate perhaps some of the reasons why Christianity has been used for anti-Semitism, why it shouldn't be, and also the other side of the coin, why Christianity has a pro-Zionist point of view and a interest in supporting Israel. So we're going to go through some of the, I think, David, are you ready to put the slides up? Yeah, so that's basically the introduction. The next one, I'm going to start off by reading from a book by a man called Andrei Schwarzbart. It's called The Last of the Just. It's based on a Jewish legend of the 36 just men, or the Lamed Vav, which is a kind of mystical Hasidic Judaism concept that there are 36 just men on the earth whose role in life is to justify the purpose of humankind before God. And the story begins with, it really covers 8 generations of the Levi family, going back to the execution of an Levi ancestor in 12th century York in England, and culminating in the story of Ernie, the last of the just, who's executed at Auschwitz. And in the passage I'm just going to read, it's as Ernie is about to be taken off to the concentration camp. And in this story, he actually marries his friend Golda the night before they're taken away. And as they're preparing to go to the concentration camp, their conversation turns to Jesus. And this is what it says. "Oh, Ernie," Golda said to them, "you tell me, why do the Christians hate us the way they do? They seem so nice when I can look at them without my star." Ernie put his hand round her shoulder solemnly. "It's very mysterious," he murmured in Yiddish. "They don't exactly know why themselves. I've been in their churches and I've read their gospel. Do you know who the Christ was? A simple Jew like your father, kind of Hasid." Golda smiled gently. "You're kidding me." No, believe me. And I bet they'd have got along fine, the two of them, because he really was a good Jew. You know, sort of like the Baal Shem Tov, a merciful man and gentle. The Christians say they love him, but I think they hate him without knowing it. So they take the cross by one end and make a sword out of it and strike us with it. "You understand, Golda," he cried out, suddenly strangely excited. "They take the cross and turn it around. They turn it around. My God." Poor Jesus, if he came back to the earth and saw that the pagans had made a sword out of him and used it against his sisters and brothers, he'd be sad. He'd grieve forever. And maybe he does see it. A moving account and a sentiment which really distresses me actually as I read it. Of course, I believe that Jesus was more than a simple Jew, but nevertheless, when we read the Gospels, we have to recognize that Jesus was thoroughly Jewish from start to finish. And we also have to recognize that what it says here, what Ernie said there, is true, that the professing church has historically done exactly what it shouldn't have done and taken the cross and used it to smite the Jewish people with. And as he says, this is totally contrary to the will and the teaching of Jesus. And he does grieve over it, what has been done in his name. Let's just have a look at 1 or 2 verses which tell us about the Jewishness of Jesus. First verse of the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1. If you put it into Hebrew, it says, Sefer Toldot Yeshua HaMashiach ben David ben Avraham. The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. In Luke's gospel, it says that when he was 8 days old, 8 days were completed for the circumcision of the child. His name was called Yeshua, Jesus. It also tells us in Luke that following that, he went up to Jerusalem with Mary and Joseph to go through the Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn service in the temple. The only event which is recorded in the life of Jesus as a child is when he is 12 years old. And it says in the Gospel of Luke that when he was 12 years old, they were taken up with the family to Jerusalem for the Passover. And at that time, he became separated from I think we've gone a bit too far here, David, so go back a bit. He's become separated from the large family group, and he ends up discussing the issues of the Torah with the teachers in the temple. Even one further back than that. Then in Luke chapter 4, it says, at the beginning of his ministry, he goes around Galilee teaching in the synagogues, then goes to his hometown in Nazareth. And it says, so he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. He was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah. But it says, as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath to read. And he reads from the prophet Isaiah, where it says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he anointed me to preach good news and he applies it to himself and his purpose of coming into the world. We see also that if you look in the New Testament, all of his disciples are Jewish. You look at some medieval art and you see that Peter, James, and John, who are good Christian boys, given Christian names, all look like English people or Germans. And Judas, the bad guy, he's always looks very Jewish. But in fact, they're all Jewish. Peter is Shimon, Kepha. James is Yaakov. John is Yochanan. And they're all Jewish disciples of Jesus. He tells his disciples not to go to the Gentiles, but to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Okay, move on now. He tells a Samaritan woman that salvation is of the Jews in John's Gospel. It says he's not come to destroy the Torah, but to fulfill it. Matthew chapter 5. And he answers the question, which is the greatest of the commandments, by quoting the Shema in Mark chapter 12, where he says, the first of all commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment. And the second is likewise, you should love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. A totally Jewish answer to the question, what is the greatest commandment? He participates in the Jewish festivals, in Sukkot at Feast of Tabernacles in John chapter 7, in the Passover. And of course, the Last Supper is in the context of a Seder meal. Read in Matthew chapter 26. It's in the context of the Seder meal that Jesus takes the bread and the wine and applies it to himself, but it's in the context of Passover meal. And the New Testament connects his death to the Passover, his resurrection also to the Chag Bikurim, the Feast of the First Fruits. And after the resurrection, Jesus explains what has happened to the disciples. In Luke's Gospel, it says, these are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me. Refers to the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim, the three divisions of the Tanakh of the Jewish Bible. So anyone who reads these passages and reads the New Testament has to understand that Jesus is Jewish, that the Gentiles play little part in the drama until the final trial before Pilate. And what also strikes me is that all these verses actually don't have any other interpretation. You can't interpret the fact that Jesus says, it says that he was circumcised on the 8th day any other way than that's what happened. You could deny that that's what happened, but you can't interpret it any other way. So we have this picture which comes through. Any intelligent reading of the New Testament shows the Jewishness of Jesus. Nevertheless, we see that the New Testament and certain verses in it have been used for anti-Semitism. So we have to look at those. So next one. The most notorious verse of all is in Matthew chapter 27. We'll come on to say a bit about that in a moment, where before Pontius Pilate, the people answered and said, his blood be upon us and upon our children. John's Gospel chapter 5, verse 18, it says, therefore the Jews sought all the more to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also said that God was his father, making himself equal with God. In John 8, he says, you are of your father, the devil, the desires of your father you want to do. And in 1 Thessalonians, you brethren became imitators of the church of God, which are in Judea in Christ Jesus. For you also suffered the same things from your own countrymen, just as they did from the Judeans, and the AV says from the Jews, who killed both the Lord Jesus and their own prophets. They persecuted us, they do not please God, and are contrary to all men. And so we have verses which speak to a vision which is contrary to the Jews and could be used for anti-Semitism. Now, I want to explain these and show that actually, if you look at these in context, there is a different interpretation which can be taken. First of all, we have to recognize that the Gospels do record a conflict between Jesus and the Jewish religious leaders, between the scribes and the Pharisees. There are two main issues which actually came up in the quote from John, which I gave you earlier. Accusation of Sabbath breaking. If you look in the scriptures, you'll find that Jesus affirmed Torah observance, but he didn't go along with what we call the traditions of the elders, which were the fence laws which were brought in after the return from Babylon, which became the oral Torah, became the Talmud as it was written down. So Jesus had a division with the religious leaders on this issue. We see also that the claim of equality with God and the Messiah issue was one which is significant. Jesus also saw corruption in the temple, in the priesthood. If you go to Matthew chapter 23, he accused the religious leadership of hypocrisy, of exploiting the people by loading burdens upon them and doing nothing to help lift the burdens. The time of the cleansing of the temple, when he goes in and drives out the money changers, he quotes from the prophets saying, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples, but you have made it a den of thieves." So he has a confrontation with the Jewish religious leaders at his time. Now, you could also show, go looking at the Hebrew scriptures, particularly the book of Jeremiah, that the prophet also had his issues with the religious leaders of his time, and that also even that they sought to kill him. So we have something which is not totally new in the history of the Bible. Rabbi Dan Cohen Sherbrooke says, like the prophets of Israel, Jesus can be seen as the conscience of Israel. In his confrontation with the leaders of the nation, Jesus echoed the words of the prophets by denouncing hypocrisy and injustice. As a prophetic figure, this image of Jesus should be recognizable to all Jews. The second issue, of course, the messianic issue, claims to be the Son of God, major theological issue, which particularly in the Gospel of John concerns Jesus as the Son of God, was the issue actually upon which Caiaphas declared that he should be put to death because of his answer to the question, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven," at which point Caiaphas said that he heard his blasphemy, he's deserving of death. I'm not going to go into in details on the issue. It's still an issue, of course, between Christians and Jewish people today, whether Jesus is the Messiah, whether he's the Son of God. Major issue. As a believing Christian, I do believe he is the Messiah, and I do believe in his divinity as well as his humanity, but it's quite beyond the scope of this talk really to go into details on that subject. But I want to just say a little bit about the use of the Jews in the Gospel of John. So if we move on to the next one. This is one of the phrases which has been used most to foment the idea that you have Jesus and the disciples who are the good guys who are Christians against the Jews who are the bad guys. And it's been used to stir up anti-Jewish feeling down through the centuries. We could go back, I could have asked, back, John, back, Peter, David, could you go back to that one? Yeah. Yep. No. Previous one. Can you go back to the previous one? Yeah, that's the fun. No, I don't know. We got lost a bit here. Okay, go on. Bit one further. Next one. Next one. No, go the wrong way. Never mind. Oh well, we'll have to leave those. I could do it without those, but yeah. Okay, we'll just leave it there for the moment. Okay, so he claims in the Gospel of John, the use of the word "the Jews" is often used to speak of the Jewish religious leaders in Judea, the Judeans versus the Galileans. And we do see that the center of opposition to Jesus did come with the Jewish religious leaders in Judea. Even there, it wasn't universal, but the opposition was there, and there were Jews in Judea who sought to kill Jesus. And Jesus says behind this opposition, there is the spirit of the devil. So he says, "You're of your father, the devil," not to all Jews, but to some of the Jewish religious leaders who did want to kill him. And that doesn't mean, certainly, that Jesus is saying that all Jews are of the devil. I would say on this subject, though, that the spirit which then came upon the church later on and sought to kill the Jews was certainly also of the devil. So we have a wrong influence bringing this hatred towards Jewish people. Okay, now when you look at the use of the term "the Jews" in John, there are certain phrases where it's clear that he's talking not about all Jewish people, but about the Judeans. One of them, particularly in this verse in John 11, verse 54, says, therefore Jesus no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there into the country near the wilderness to a city called Ephraim, and there remained with his disciples. So was Ephraim a Goyish place? Well, Ephraim was the name which is used in the prophets to speak about the northern kingdom of Israel. So he moved out of Judea into the area of Ephraim. So when we read the Jews in John's Gospel, you've got to discern what he's actually meaning by it. And for the most part, he's talking either about Judeans as opposed to Galileans, or the Jewish religious leaders. Now, the Jewish religious leaders, particularly Caiaphas, the chief priest, did want Jesus to die. He was opposed to Jesus, and in one statement in John's Gospel, it says that Jesus should die for the people. It says, because if we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Now, this actually shows you that Jesus had a large following amongst the Jewish people. And the following was so large that Caiaphas was afraid that if he didn't do something to remove Jesus, it's going to cause some kind of a problem which would upset the Romans and would then cause the Romans to come and to take away our nation. So let's move on and look about the one about his blood be upon us and upon our children. This is the verse which has been used. It's in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 26, which has been used perhaps more than any other to say that because certain Jews made this statement before Pontius Pilate, calling for the death of Jesus, therefore the death of Jesus should be avenged upon all Jews for all time to all generations. This is clearly a false interpretation of the scripture. If you read carefully particularly in the book of Matthew, you'll see that what was happening at this time, you had a crowd which had gathered in front of Pontius Pilate in the Praetorium, probably in the Antonia fortress, which is to the north of the temple site. Scholars say there's a maximum of perhaps 500 to possibly 2,000 people who could be there. Were they all the Jewish people, the entire Jewish people? No. They were a selection of people who were probably picked by Jesus' enemies to show up for his execution. Now, estimates of the number of people who'd be in Jerusalem at this time for the Passover were in the hundreds of thousands. And many Jews who were there were for Jesus. In fact, if you look in Mark's Gospel, it says that the common people heard him gladly. You had a crowd of people who were at the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem who were greeting him with the words, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hoshiana, calling him Melech Israel, Ben David. So clearly supporters of Jesus. It's also interesting, if you look in the 26th chapter of Matthew, Caiaphas organized a meeting, the chief priest, to take Jesus, quote, by trickery and kill him. Says, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. So he's discussing how to arrest Jesus. If he said, if we arrest him publicly at the feast, there's going to be an uproar among the people. So why should there be an uproar among the people if everyone hated Jesus and wanted to get rid of him? There'd be an uproar amongst the people because there are many people who are for Jesus, and if they arrested him publicly, it could cause a riot. That's why you had to recruit Judas, so that he could lead them to where they could arrest Jesus secretly at night and take him for the trial, put charges against him with a verdict that he deserved to die, and then hand him over to Pontius Pilate. Now, I've written a long article on this, which I won't go into details of, but my understanding is that actually Pontius Pilate was in a way being manipulated by the chief priests to do something which he didn't want to do. He knew that the setup was a setup, but he was basically being blackmailed by the chief priest to pass a sentence of death upon Jesus. There was an idea behind it that if he didn't do that, they'd report him to Caesar as someone supporting a rival claimant to be king, or cause a riot which would look bad on his record. So Pilate knew that it wasn't true, but he didn't have the courage to just throw the case out. He went along with it, and he handed over Jesus to be flogged and put to death, even though he knew that there was a false case against him. And when we come to the text in mind, it says, when Pilate saw that he could do nothing to prevail at all, but rather that the multitude was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I'm innocent of the blood of this just person, you see to it. And all the people answered and said, his blood be upon us and upon our children. So was it all the people, the entire Jewish people for all time, or the people who were there at that event? His blood be upon us. It was spoken to Pilate, not to God. It was spoken by Jewish opponents of Jesus, not by all Jews. I've said there were many Jews who were for him. It was a foolish word, which is also not binding upon their children and their descendants and their future descendant generations. The Bible actually doesn't teach collective guilt, but personal responsibility before God. In Ezekiel chapter 18, it says, the soul that sins shall die, the son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. And you have similar concepts actually in the New Testament teaching. On the cross, Jesus pleads for forgiveness, not vengeance on those responsible. He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. When you come to the New Testament, it actually defines who is responsible for the death of Jesus in the book of Acts, where it says, for truly against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate with the Gentiles and the people of Israel were gathered together to do whatever your hand and your purpose determined to be done. So actually it says that it was the will of God that Jesus should die. All people were involved, Jews and Gentiles, and there's no way that this could be used as a justification for cursing all Jews at all times for the death of Jesus. Okay, let's move on and see what happened, how this develops in church history. When you look in the book of Acts, you find that the church at the beginning was all Jewish. The Gentiles only came in after Acts chapter 10. You had a Nazarene church which kept Jewish feasts and the Messianic faith in Jesus throughout the first century and beyond. And Paul wrote his epistle to the Romans, telling Gentile Christians to bring good news to the Jews, to pray for Israel, and that the root that supports them is Jewish. They should not boast against the Jews, that the Jews should be beloved for the Father's sakes, and that the gift and calling of God is without repentance. So you have the apostles who were Jewish, the scriptures written by Jews. You have a writing by Paul that the church should not boast against the Jews, but should pray for the Jewish people, should bring good news to them, and also saw a future for Israel when the deliverer will come to Zion. And one has to say that the history of the church would be very different if the Roman church had taken note of what Paul wrote to the Romans. But they didn't. So let's look at what happened in church history. In church history, we find that the opposite to what Paul said took place. The majority Gentile church ignored Paul's teaching, did the opposite of what he said, brought bad news to the Jews, and cursed the Jews as Christ killers, based on some of these verses which I've read, which, as I hope I've explained to you, were taken out of context and misapplied for generations to bring untold suffering to Jewish people. We have early church writers like John Chrysostom, considered to be a saint and a church father, lived in the 4th century, who wrote, "The Jews are the most worthless of all men. They're perfidious murderers of Christ. The Jews are odious assassins of Christ, and for killing God, there is no expiation possible, no indulgence or pardon. Christians may never cease vengeance, and the Jews must live in servitude forever. God always hated the Jews. It's incumbent upon Christians to hate the Jews." Statement which is totally out of order and totally wrong in the sight of God. When Constantine established Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire in 312, he issued many anti-Jewish laws. Council of Nicaea, he said it's right to demand what our reason approves, that we should have nothing in common with the Jews. The links between Christianity and Judaism were broken. Sabbath was changed from the 7th to the first day of the week. Date of Easter was separated from the Passover. Augustine became the main theologian of the Catholic Church and taught that the church had replaced Israel, that all promises of restoration and blessing to Israel were now transferred to the church, while the curses and judgments could remain upon Israel and the Jews. This became a reinterpretation of scripture, which continued to be the dominant theme in replacement theology, both Catholic and Protestant churches. And as Christianity in its Roman Catholic form became the dominant religion of Europe, those who rejected it became the forces of the Antichrist to be despised and rejected, i.e. the Jewish people, which led then to centuries of persecution leading up to the Crusades in 1096. As the Crusaders began their journey to the Holy Land to liberate it from the Muslims, they said, we're going to fight Christ's enemies in Palestine, i.e. the Muslims, but should we not forget our enemies in the midst, i.e. the Jews? 12,000 Jews were killed in cities along the Rhine alone. When the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099, they massacred all the Jews and Muslims they could find. Pope Innocent III in 1215 condemned the Jews to eternal slavery by declaring, the Jews against whom the blood of Jesus Christ calls out, although they ought not to be killed, lest the Christian people forget the divine law, yet as wanderers ought they to remain upon the earth until their countenance be filled with shame. I don't like to read these passages out, but they speak about an attitude which had come into the church, which was totally foreign to what Jesus taught, and which was totally anti-Christian, fundamentally. Followed by ritual murder charges against the Jews, as in 1114 in Norwich, where Jews were accused of killing a Christian child at Passover time to drain its blood in order to make Passover matzahs. This hideous, ridiculous charge resurfaced time and again, most recently in the Muslim world, leading to massacres of the Jews. In 1290, King Edward I expelled all Jews from England. Spanish Inquisition against all Jewish people and non-Catholic Christians, leading to 1492, the Jews given the choice of forced baptism or expulsion from Spain. One has to say even that Martin Luther hoped initially that he would attract Jews to his Protestant faith, understanding they couldn't accept the superstitions and persecutions of Rome, but when they refused his attempts to convert them, he turned on them and uttered words of hatred which were used word for word by the Nazis in their propaganda. And you have the 19th century, the Russian Orthodox Church driving the force of the pogroms with violent attacks on Jewish communities, the kind which are portrayed in Fiddler on the Roof. They had one solution to the Jewish problem, which was 1/3 extermination, 1/3 forcible conversion to Christianity, 1/3 expulsion. And Hitler, speaking to his legal advisor in 1938, said in the Gospels, the Jews called out to Pilate when he refused to crucify Jesus, his blood be upon us and upon our children's children. Perhaps I have to fulfill this curse. A terrible history of Jewish suffering, showing the terrible truth of that most of it has been instigated by people who claim to be Christians and who brought this accusation against the Jewish people that the Jews killed Jesus and therefore are under a curse and should be persecuted by the church, which was based on a false reading of the New Testament and a denial of the true message of Jesus and the apostles. Now, one has to say that this was not the uniform narrative. For most of the time when this was taking place, the Bible itself was not available for the people to check it out. David, you've gone on. Go back to the previous one. That's the previous one. That's all. Yeah. Yeah, keep it there. Was not a uniform narrative. The Bible wasn't translated into languages which people could read. It was in Latin. Even most priests were not educated in its context. They knew the stories, but as interpreted and taught by the corrupt church to a biblically illiterate laity. With the Reformation, there came the translation of the Bible into common languages. This was actually opposed by the Catholic Church, and one reason was that they realized that if people read what the Bible actually said, they would see a huge gulf between what it said and what they taught. People like Tyndale, who translated the Bible, were burnt at the stake for doing so. Also, as we had the development of the printing press, had an increase in literacy, people began to discover what the text actually says. And in 1611, you had the authorized version in English, and which had a huge effect upon the understanding of the Bible itself, and also an understanding of Jewish people and the prophecies of the Bible. And people began to recover the Jewish Jesus and to read some of the prophecies of restoration to Zion. Really, the prophets themselves would have been barely known by the mass of people up until this time. And as people read scriptures like Jeremiah chapter 31, hear the word of the Lord, O ye nations, he who scattered Israel will gather him as a shepherd does his flock. And Ezekiel chapter 36, I will take you from among the nations, gather you out of the countries and bring you into your own land. Isaiah 11, he will set up a banner for the nations and will assemble the outcasts of Israel, gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. And Jesus' word in Luke 21, Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, indicating to be a time when Jewish rule of Jerusalem would return. And he connected this with the parable of the budding of the fig tree, which is seen by many commentators as a parable of the restoration of national life to Israel. And this was seen also as a sign of the second coming of Jesus in New Testament terms. So as we have the Bible in English, we have a change which brings the possibility that people can actually read the book themselves and find out what it says, which was not the case for most of the period up until this time. Very interesting book I have here called The Bible and Sword by Jewish writer Barbara Tuchman. And she says, with the translation of the Bible into English and its adaptation as its highest authority for an autonomous English church, the history, traditions, and moral law of the Hebrew nation became part of the English culture, became for a period of 3 centuries the most powerful single influence on that culture. It linked, to repeat Matthew Arnold's phrase, the genius of and history of us English to the genius and history of the Hebrew people. This is far from saying that it made England a Judeo-phile nation, but without the background of the English Bible, it's doubtful that the Balfour Declaration would ever have been issued in the name of the British government or the mandate for Palestine undertaken, even given the strategic factors that later came into play. And as we see, you can move on to the next one, David. As we look at what happened in the following times, we find that the 17th century Puritans discovered the Hebrew roots of the Bible and prophecy. There was a couple called Joanna and Ebenezer Cartwright, who in 1649 wrote a petition to the government of England and Holland that this nation of England, with the inhabitants of the Netherlands, shall be the first and readiest to transport Israel's sons and daughters in their ships to the land promised to their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for an everlasting inheritance. The petition further requested that the Jews may again be received and permitted to trade and dwell amongst you in this land. That was in the land of England. And remember that actually in 1290, the Jews had been expelled from England. And this began a movement to bring the Jews from Holland to live in England, beginning of the Jewish settlement of England in around 1650. Also aided by a man called Manasseh ben Israel, a Jewish rabbi who caught on to the Cartwright Declaration and wrote a book called The Space Israel, the Hope of Israel, in which he appealed to England to complete the dispersion of the Jews by admitting them to England before the worldwide ingathering of exiles could begin. And in 1655, Cromwell agreed to this, saying that England should atone for its past cruelties to the Jews, the more so as we are children of the same father, Abraham, they naturally after the flesh, we believers after the spirit. We move on to the 19th century. In Britain, we have a period of revival of Christianity in Britain, time of Bible reading and searching, also a beginning of a worldwide missionary movement, and many began to look to the place of Israel and the Jews. We had the London Jews Society, which was backed by the great social reformer, Lord Shaftesbury, was a Bible-believing Christian. Apart from throwing himself into the works on behalf of the poor and the dispossessed, he also worked on behalf of the Jewish people, and he had a vision for the restoration of the Jews to Jerusalem and the land. He recognized the past injustices done towards the Jewish people and took up a Zionist position before Zionism was particularly well known or practiced amongst the Jewish community. Had an influence also upon the church and politics. Petitioned Lord Palmerston, and Palmerston, then the Foreign Secretary, wrote to the British ambassador in Istanbul, Constantinople in 1640 to, quote, recommend the Turkish government hold out every encouragement to the Jews of Europe to return to Palestine. And in August the 17th, in 1840, the Times published a leader on a plan to plant the Jewish people in the land of their fathers, which was now under serious consideration. Also commended the efforts of Lord Shaftesbury, the author of the plan, as practical and statesmanlike. Shaftesbury and others then agreed to plan a petition to set up a consulate in Jerusalem to look after the interests of Jewish people in Palestine as it was then. And when it was set up, Shaftesbury saw it as having prophetic significance, as the ancient city of the people of God is about to resume a place among the nations, and England is the first of the Gentile nations that ceases to tread her down. Quoting there from Jesus' words about Jerusalem being trodden down of the Gentiles, and seeing this as the beginning of the process which would lead to the Jewish population returning to Jerusalem. It's also followed by the establishment of Christ Church Jerusalem, which was founded as in the grounds of the consulate, and had the work to pave the way for the return of the Jews to the land and look after their welfare. And today you can go to Christ Church, which is just inside the Jaffa Gate, and they also have a museum there which shows some of the ways in which the church was working towards the return of the Jewish people and to building up the Jewish community in Palestine as it was then. We move on towards the end of the 19th century, and Herzl writing his book, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, which was read by an English clergyman who was the chaplain to the British embassy in Vienna, a man called Reverend William Heckler, who, when he read Herzl's book, was quite astounded by it and went to visit Herzl. And he said these words, Dr. Herzl, I stand before you. For years I've been waiting for you. For years I've announced you to princes and to statesmen, the ecclesiastical dignitaries I've encountered. I prepared the way for you. The hour has come. Your idea will triumph. Consider me at your service in our common cause. Your book is inspired, even though you may not realize it. And it is as well this way. This is the way God works. You have, for like all the world and like all the Jews in this city, you've forgotten the prophets. You no longer accord to them their rightful place, but you are of your people, and your prophets, involved for all time in the sufferings of Israel, will never leave you in peace. Like Moses in another age, the sufferings of your people in Russia, the trial of the captain of the French army, that's Dreyfus' trial, God is calling you to your long-forgotten Jerusalem. And I say this with deep emotion and will repeat it without ceasing. God is with you. You will succeed, whatever happens. And Heckler went on to encourage Herzl, to give him, he had a lot of contacts, especially in Germany, with the kind of princes and the ruling class there. And he did what he could to help Herzl in his plan to bring about the return of the Jews to Israel. And he was there at the First Zionist Congress, encouraging Herzl at that moment. So he was a Christian Zionist before the state of Israel, looking for the return of the Jewish people to Israel. We see also there was a major influence of the Bible and Christians upon the Balfour Declaration, and a partnership which was made between Chaim Weizmann and Lord Balfour. Interestingly, Weizmann actually wrote to how political leaders of his day were sympathetic to Zionism on the basis of the Bible. He addressed the Jewish Board of Deputies in 1917 and said, men like Balfour, Churchill, Lloyd George were deeply religious and believed in the Bible, that to them the return of the Jewish people to Palestine was a reality, so that we Zionists represent to them a great tradition for which they had enormous respect. And Barbara Tuchman writes about this and speaks about the influences upon Balfour. He said, long before he ever heard of Zionism, Balfour, steeped in the Bible from childhood, had felt a particular interest in the people of the book. According to his niece, companion and lifelong biographer, Mrs. Dugdale, it was a lifelong interest that originated in the Old Testament training of his mother and in his Scottish upbringing. As he grew up, his intellectual admiration and sympathy for certain aspects of Jewish philosophy and culture also grew, and the problem of the Jew in the modern world seemed to him of immense importance. He always talked eagerly on this idea, and I remember in childhood imbibing from him the idea that Christian religion and civilization owes to Judaism an immense, measurable debt, shamefully ill repaid. And this led to the British government approving the Balfour Declaration, which will be followed by the Balfour Declaration, of course, saying that His Majesty's government views with favour the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Balfour Declaration to be ratified by the League of Nations at the San Remo Conference in 1920, which confirmed the mandate of Palestine to Britain and supported the concept of the Balfour Declaration. And many have said that without this, it's unlikely that the UN would have passed the resolution for the partition of Palestine in 1947, which led to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. So we can see that there is a historical kind of link which goes from the time of the Reformation, particularly through the 19th century, up until the founding of the state, of Christians who supported the idea of a return of the Jews to Israel and the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, to be the State of Israel. Sadly, of course, we had then the horrors of the Holocaust and even the betrayal of the Balfour Declaration by the British in Palestine, but that couldn't stop the fact that in 1947, the UN voted for the establishment, for the partition of Palestine, which led to David Ben-Gurion pronouncing the establishment of the State of Israel on May the 14th, 1948. So how does this affect Christians post-Holocaust and post the establishment of Israel? Of course, the Holocaust itself led to great soul searching amongst major denominations of the church, led to some repentance for anti-Semitism, a rejection of the Jews killed Jesus theology at an official level. Here's a statement from another book which tells us about these things, Hero Israel by Grattan Guinness. In Darmstadt in 1948, the Evangelical Church in Germany acknowledged Christian involvement in the appalling wartime Jewish tragedy. So Christians circles washed their hands of all responsibility, justifying themselves by saying there was a curse on the Jewish people. Christians no longer believed that the promises concerning the Jews still held good. They no longer preached it, nor showed in their attitude to the Jews. In this way, we Christians helped to bring about all the injustice and suffering inflicted upon the Jews in our country, and led to a repentance for that. And in the Catholic Church as well, we see that there was a change of heart. Pope John the 23rd said shortly before he died in 1963, we realize now that many centuries of blindness have dimmed our eyes, so we no longer see the beauty of thy chosen people, no longer recognize in their faces the features of our firstborn brother. We realize that our brows are branded with the mark of Cain. Centuries long has Abel lain in blood and tears because we had forgotten thy love. Forgive us the curse which we unjustly laid on the name of the Jews. Forgive us that with that curse we crucified thee a second time. Well, apart from dealing with the Holocaust, once the State of Israel was established, we saw that many Christians saw in this the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, the restoration of Israel. Many supported the right of Israel to exist, and in the following years, numerous organizations developed, believing that the State of Israel and the existence of Israel is right in the sight of God and is a fulfillment of prophecy. Christians also recognized Israel's immense achievements as a sign of God's favor with Israel, including its victories in wars against all the odds, 1948, 1967, 1973. Even events like the Entebbe rescue saw the hand of God in Israel's victories. particularly 1967, which saw the fact that Jerusalem was now in Jewish hands, was seen by many as an encouragement to the ultimate redemption of Israel and Jerusalem being no longer trodden down of the Gentiles, but being the Jewish capital of the state of Israel. It's actually at that point that I came into the picture, because I remember that in 1967, I was in my second year at university, studying for my exams and reading the news and feeling that there was some important thing taking place in the Middle East and feeling very pro-Israel. And even hitchhiked down from Cambridge to London to offer my services at a Jewish agency. They didn't need them because in 6 days they did pretty well without me. But I had this feeling there was something important taking place there. I couldn't explain why. I wasn't a Christian and I'm not Jewish, but when I became a Christian 3 years later and read the Bible, I began to see the significance of these events and the significance of Israel's restoration. Christians also supported Israel's efforts in the land becoming fertile, which was also seen as another fulfillment of prophecy. Isaiah, Ezekiel speak about trees being planted in the land, ancient cities being rebuilt, the land becoming fertile, causing the desert to blossom as a rose, to fill the face of the earth with fruit, and the export of Israel's agricultural achievements around the world, another sign of God's blessing upon Israel. And also technology and medicine and other achievements of Israel. And out of this came a number of pro-Israeli organizations, including a lot of pro-Israel influence upon some of the God TV programs. Revelation TV has a regular pro-Israel slot with our friend Simon Barrett, which I think Sharon has also appeared upon. And also in America, even more so, we see that the influence of pro-Israel has spread to America firstly through certain Christian influences, Darby, Blackstone, Scofield Reference Bible, giving a theological underpinning for the modern pro-Israel movement in the States. And also we see that in America, very influential evangelical churches supporting Israel and having even a political influence upon the situation. Many supporting Trump in his bringing the embassy up to Jerusalem, proposing a peace process which would leave Jerusalem undivided in Jewish hands, retaining Judea and Samaria settlements and the Jordan Valley and the Golan Heights. And so we have this pro-Israel influence, which has been particularly important in America in advocating for Israel, with a pro-Zionist voting bloc taking place. We have to say that this is not the whole picture, because there has grown up in recent times a anti-Christian Zionist movement. So if we can move on to the next one. Another book here called Israel Betrayed by Paul Wilkinson, which gives a lot of details of what is called the rise of Christian Palestinianism. Can you get the next slide up, David? Movement called Sabayel, an Arab liberation theology, which often sees Jesus as a Palestinian freedom fighter against the Jews. Yasser Arafat, speaking in Bethlehem in 1995, said, "This is the birthplace of our Lord, the Messiah, the Palestinian. We pronounce this holy land, this holy city, this city of the Palestinian Jesus, a liberated city forever." And this becomes a part of a rewrite of history by the Palestinian Authority and by these pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian Christian movement within the church to deny Israel's right to exist, to erase the Jewish people's history in the land of Israel, and invent an ancient Palestinian, Muslim, and Arab history in the land. Basically, it's a fabrication. Jesus was not a Palestinian, he was Jewish. And the whole Palestinian aspect of it is something which has been made up. One of the leaders of this movement is a man called Naim Atik. I'll quote from some of his writings here. He says, "At this Christmas time, our celebrations are marred by the destructive powers of the modern day Herods who are represented in the Israeli government. Indeed, violence breeds violence and innocent people have been killed on both sides. But the original sin is the violence of the Israeli occupation. It is the occupation that is evil and violent. It is apartheid in its ugliest form. The message for this Christmas is a call to struggle against all forms of dehumanization, domination, apartheid, racism, occupation, oppression, and ethnic cleansing. The people of the first century Palestine were looking for salvation and liberation from the oppressive yoke of the Roman Empire. Today's Palestinians are looking for salvation and liberation from the oppressive yoke of Israel. Ironically, Israel prefers to keep entrenching its occupation, expanding its illegal settlements, and devouring Palestinian land. The light of truth is beginning to shine, and it will dispel the darkness that has spread regarding Palestine. Here in Palestine, Jesus is walking the Via Dolorosa. Jesus is the powerless Palestinian humiliated at the checkpoint, the woman trying to get through to the hospital for treatment, and so it goes on. Palestine has become one huge Golgotha. The Israeli government crucifixion system is operating daily. Palestine has become the place of the skull. A gross exaggeration of the situation, and something which is not giving the truth of what is taking place. Obviously, there are injustices, there are problems, but the fact is that in Bethlehem, for example, the Christian population has fallen from around 80% in the 1970s when it was under Israel to around 20 to 30% now that it's under the Palestinian Authority. And it's not because of Israel, it's because of Muslim infiltration. In fact, the only place in the Middle East where traditional Arab Christians have peace and safety is within Israel. Syria, Iraq, the Palestinian Authority area, Gaza, there's been a massive decline, not because of Israel, but because of Islamic hostility. Now, the influence of Sabael and others has affected much of the church. The World Council of Churches with liberal theology has mixed traditional Christian contempt for the Jews with kind of Marxist liberation movements and liberation theology. One of the major spokesmen for this has been Stephen Sizer, I've heard of. Also, we have Garth Hewitt of the Amos Trust, Colin Chapman, author of Whose Promised Land. Others who are influencing mainline churches to oppose the existence, oppose Israel and oppose Zionism. There's a call to Western Christians to reject the assumption that the Israeli occupation of Jerusalem and a large part of Palestine is somehow the fulfillment of prophecy. Church of Scotland produced a report in 2013, much influenced by Stephen Sizer, which said that the Christian Zionist viewpoint worldview has a cataclysmic consequences for religiously integrated and lasting peace in Palestine, Israel. Christian Zionism portrays an unjust God with an unjust people and seeks to exclude and expel and arguably eliminate whatever is perceived to be alien to its cause. I believe that is untrue. I'm a Christian Zionist. I believe in the state of Israel. I would like to see a just and lasting peace for Israel and the Arab world. But I know that the major problem in achieving this is that the Palestinians are, for the most part, motivated by an ideology which aims at the exclusion and expulsion of Israeli Jews and even their extermination. They may have formally renounced the Palestine National Covenant, which calls for that, but they're still acting upon it. And the Hamas Covenant does call for that. These things are never mentioned by the opponents of Israel. It's interesting that after the Oslo Accords, Arafat was accused by some of his supporters of betraying the cause by negotiating with the Jews. He said, don't worry, this is part of the phased policy which we all agreed to in 1974. The phased policy, actually the 10 points phased policy, was policy agreed by the PLO at that time to secure a territory on any part of Israel chooses to withdraw from, and then use that as a base from which to dismantle Israel. And you could say that that is basically the policy which even today the Palestinian Authority and certainly Hamas is following, supporting terror, indoctrinating their children with a hatred for Israel, and still basically aiming at the elimination of Israel. See also that they're equating Zionism with racism according to the UN formula, which is another horrible accusation. And generally they side with the Islamic movement against Israel. They don't criticize the atrocious human rights record of Islamists, but they do criticize Israel. One of the most shameful things which happened was that Stephen Sizer went to Iran, had his book on Christian Zionism translated into Farsi, addressed a whole group of high-up people in Iran with the approval of the daughter of Ayatollah Khomeini. And he spoke of Christian jihad as submission to the will of God. It's to become like Jesus. One day the whole world will be brought into submission to God's perfect will, inshallah, and we have much in common with fundamentalist Islam. Well, fundamentalist Islam is slaughtering Christians around the world, bringing terrible injustice against oppressive regimes on the suffering people of Iran, Afghanistan, wars and terror in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Nigeria, much of the Sahel region of Africa, and now into Mozambique and other parts of Africa. Generally, these people have nothing to say about this, only that somehow Christians who support Israel's right to exist with a hope for a peaceful democratic government in Israel are responsible for all the trouble in the world. Now we see sadly that this is a major influence on a number of NGOs and Christian organizations, World Council of Churches, Presbyterian Church, the Church of Scotland, World Vision, Christian Aid, Oxfam. All of these are supporting this view, also supporting the replacement theology, really, idea of Augustine. I once did a debate with Colin Chapman, the author of Whose Promised Land. I spoke of the prophecies of the Jews coming from the north, south, east, and west to Israel in prophecy. He said this fulfilled the word of Jesus of the Gentiles coming from the north, south, east, and west into the church. Classic piece of replacement theology. Generally, they would reject and spiritualize prophecies about Israel's restoration, concept of a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob having anything to do with the land today, and would have no concept of a second coming of Jesus Christ or a millennial reign from Jerusalem. Paul Wilkinson describes the end game which they're working towards, Sabael is working towards, which is, if I can find the page, yeah. So Sabael's vision embraces two sovereign states, Palestine and Israel, which will enter into confederation or even a federation, possibly with other neighboring countries where Jerusalem becomes the federal capital. Indeed, the ideal and best solution has always been to envisage ultimately a binational state in Palestine, Israel, where people are free and equal, one state for two nations and three religions. That might sound okay, but if you follow it through and realize what it would mean, it would actually mean the end of Israel. It would mean that huge numbers of Palestinian refugees would flood into the land, they would become a majority, and because of the hostility to the Jewish people, they would end up pushing Israel out of the land. And it would mean the end of the state of Israel. And you see that basically most of these people, if you really understand their program, it is the same as the left Islamic program: from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. Following the words in the Psalm 83, let us cut them off from being a nation, let the name of Israel be remembered no more. But it won't happen because God has a plan to keep Israel and to preserve Israel as a nation. And just to wrap it up, let's see where we are at today, where all this is leading to. Okay. We do see a growing anti-Semitism in Europe, and most potent form of this anti-Semitism is actually not the classic Jews killed Jesus, Christian-influenced anti-Semitism. It's an alliance of left-wing and Islamist anti-Zionists. If you look at these people, they're also pretty anti-Christian as well. What we're seeing also is a decline of America, the late great United States of America, a decline of the Christian and pro-Israel influence in America. Looks to me like the Biden administration is taking a very negative line on Israel and Iran. The Iran nuclear issue is particularly dangerous for the future. And we see that Israel is being in some ways betrayed by what is taking place at the present time. Interesting, we've also seen some peace treaties with Israel and Sunni Arab countries, which see Israel as an alliance against the Iran. We also see a kind of economic alliance which is built up with Israel, Egypt, Greece, Cyprus, over the oil and gas find off in the Mediterranean. So we see one movement towards peace, but we also see movements towards war. Will there be war or peace in the Middle East? That's actually the title of my latest magazine in Light for the Last Days. Bible prophecy actually does indicate the coming of a series of troubles, including the war of Gog and Magog, Ezekiel 38, 39. And if you follow through some of the passages in the book of Ezekiel, you can see that the countries are lining up pretty much as it says in the Bible. Russia is in Syria, Iran's in Syria, Turkey is in Syria, to the north of Israel. Iran is leading the hostility against Israel at the present time, and the possibility of war breaking up in the north is a real possibility. We see also that Jerusalem and the West Bank, Judea and Samaria are the main issues for future of negotiations, which ties in with the prophecy in Ezekiel in Zechariah chapter 12, Jerusalem being the burdensome stone, burdening all nations. And in this, we see also that there is both a Jewish and a Christian expectation of the coming of the Messiah. I was looking at some articles by a man called Rabbi Winston, who takes Ezekiel 38, 39 literally, and Zechariah 12 to 14 literally, and sees in them the forerunners of the coming of the Jewish Messiah. He doesn't see them as the forerunning of the coming of Jesus, but as a Christian myself, I do see this as prophecies which are looking to the second coming of Jesus the Messiah, following a time of great trouble in the last days. And it looks to me very much like we are living in the last days, and we're seeing the movement towards the fulfillment of these Bible prophecies. As both a negative, in that it says there's going to be a time of great trouble, unlike any that has been before or ever shall be, and a positive that it speaks about the coming of the Messiah, who will then bring an end to war and bring in the prophecy of Isaiah, and the Lord will reign from Jerusalem. There will be swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks, and not study war anymore. And the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea, a hopeful future and a hopeful end. Whatever happens, Israel high, the people of Israel live. And just in conclusion, I believe that whatever takes place in the coming days, believing Christians should stand by Israel and the Jewish people, should inform themselves of what's taking place, should pray for Israel, should love the people of Israel, and should defend them against those who come to seek to destroy them. So that's really what I close with. If anyone's got any, I don't know, got any questions or anything you want to ask me or say to them.
So Tony, thank you so much for your talk and for coming forward to be involved with this discussion. We've known you for a long time, but we've never really had this in-depth discussion. And there are a lot of comments that are coming through on the chat. Some very interesting, quite deep comments and questions. I just want to say that like Jews, Christians are not homogenous. And what came up before in our last event was this discussion that Tony has so kindly brought to us to explain to us a Christianity that for me, I'm not all that knowledgeable about. My Christianity knowledge comes from what I learned at school in South Africa. So it was very illuminating to have that explanation and to have Tony explain the difference between where our friends, the Christian Zionists, stand and where the anti-Israel, anti-Semitic Christians stand. And for me, the question arises is, seeing that we have this friendship that we've developed, and not only for us personally, but with the Christian Zionists, and realizing that as Jews, we don't stand alone on this issue, how can we look forward to combining our efforts to try and dispel the falsehoods that are being put forward in replacement theology and also in Islamic anti-Semitism? One of the issues we face a lot now is social media. And as I said to you, that Ambrosine and I track social media for anti-Semitism. And what we're finding a lot is that children are being influenced on social media sites like TikTok, Twitter, and other sort of sites that younger children go to. And in preaching Dawa, what we find is that these children are being told now that Jesus was a Palestinian. And this is a story, a narrative that we hear not only from children, but we hear it from what we call from Palestinianism. So this is a discussion we need to have. And there are a lot of issues that have arisen. I'm going to call on David to try and combine some of those issues and bring them to you so that we don't dot around and cover the ground again and again. So David, unmute and see if you can put this forward, and then we'll call on various people perhaps to add to that.
Thank you, Tony. That was very, very enlightening and really very, very thought-provoking. The two questions, the two people who submitted to me the most probing questions are Jonathan Hoffman and Ambrosine.
Okay.
And they have come up with what could be categorized as the silence of the church.
Yes.
The church is as threatened as is Judaism with the future. The church was silent in the Holocaust. It didn't speak out at all. Today, there are things happening all round where the church is actually like that Jesus was a Muslim.
Yeah.
Nobody on a large scale aspect is voicing this. And are you not concerned that there is this element of silence within the global Christian community?
Definitely, yes. I mean, I guess we could all be more active and more outspoken on these subjects, but certainly the persecution of Christians in Muslim countries is a terrible issue which is taking place and which has been largely silenced on. I guess one of the problems is that a lot of the kind of sort of movement today, even the present Pope, I mean, he's trying to get together with the Muslims to make a sort of alliance to save the world. And you've got this kind of interfaith thing that you've got to work together. You mustn't offend the Muslims and you mustn't say anything which is harmful to them. It might be racist or Islamic phobic. And we're kind of intimidated into not speaking out against what's taking place in these countries. And yeah, I think it's a major thing which we need to be doing more to speak on about. Finding the time and the energy and the opportunities to do that is another question, but we need perhaps to work together as we can to speak on this subject and to raise it in all circles, whether religious or political, so that people are aware of what is taking place. So, yeah, I mean, what can I say? I agree that we need to be more vocal. And certainly the church in the time of the Holocaust was shamefully silent. There were individuals who risked their lives and gave their lives in some cases to save Jewish people and to stand up for righteousness. But the majority found some ways to justify what Hitler was doing and to keep silent, which was certainly not what they should have been doing as believing Christians.
Okay, so
another question from David Baines, a comment. That some of the most vehement opponents of the 19th century Aliyah were Arab Christians. How's that reconciled within the Christian church?
Yeah, and I mean, still, the people I supported to who are resisting Christian Zionism now, for mostly were Arab Christians. So they have a view that I suppose the Jews coming in, it's their land and the Jews are stealing their land and they shouldn't be there. They weren't entirely, actually, but I mean, there was a Faisal, though I don't think he was a Christian, was he? He saw some benefits in the Jews coming to the land to help the Arabs to develop it. And so, and also today there are Arab Christians who see benefit in Israel being there. So it's not a total rejection by the Arab Christians. But yeah, that's, I suppose it's, yeah.
I'll just make a comment about that. You probably know that Ambrosine and I have spent a lot of time on the streets, and some of the people we meet at demonstrations are Arab Christians.
Yeah.
And some of them come and talk to us, and what they tell us is that they tell us things in private, away from the public eye, because they're frightened of what would happen to their families that are still living in those areas. So very often, being Christian doesn't mean that they're anti-Jewish. It's just that they, I guess, in a way, trying to preserve their families.
Yeah.
So this is one of the issues, if that answers that question a little bit. But I think this is a very deep subject, and I think we need a lot of thought and to go into further discussion about the depth of it. But I would like to focus quite a lot on how we can work together as two communities. I know you're a small community, but I also know there's Revelation TV and there's QFI. And I'm just wondering how we can depart from the usual kind of stuff that comes out of meetings and events that people hold. How can we depart from that and probe much sort of more in depth into changing this narrative that's increasingly being taught in our schools? I mean, one of the issues that Ambrosine and I also do is follow what happens in schools, and we're finding that in our schools, their teacher exchanges, for instance, with teachers from what they call Palestine. And they're coming into our schools here in the UK and bringing goodness knows what information to young children, 16, 17-year-old children in schools. So how can we join as a community to combat this? Yeah,
I mean, I suppose if we can produce material and get it in there, it's again not easy to do. Schools and universities, of course, is the other major issue. So, I mean, one of the, I think I was reading in the Jewish Chronicle or somewhere that Jews hope that education would be the answer to anti-Semitism, but now they're finding that education is actually one of the main sources of anti-Semitism. And so, because of the biased view that's given of the Israel-Palestine issue, so we have to try to move into that. I mean, obviously I'm limited in time and energy, and I'm getting older, and taking on so many more things. You think, well, what can you do? And
I know how you feel. I think we need most of us here know that.
Try to, take opportunities, and I appreciate all that you're doing to make the cause known. I guess we could be using the internet much more, and it's one of the areas where we could get more information on, and perhaps work together on that to put Israel's point of view and to resist this anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism spirit. So,
I think I'm going to, if Jonathan doesn't mind, if Jonathan wants to enter the discussion, Jonathan Hoffman.
Yeah, I'll tell what he has to say.
Because I know that Jonathan has got a huge knowledge about all those issues you spoke about Amos Trust and CISA and all of these elements of replacement theology that you spoke about. So perhaps Jonathan might like to come in and say a few things. Jonathan, unmute yourself.
Yeah, okay. Tony, thank you for really a tour de force. That was fantastic and much appreciated. I think the main thing I want to say is that Christians are too quiet. Christian Zionists, when it comes to, for example, this horrible professor in Bristol, Professor Miller, who is really, really nasty things, I don't see Christian Zionists, when we do demonstrations in the street, I don't see Christian Zionists coming out. I don't see them writing to newspapers. I don't see them on talk shows. So my main encouragement to the Christians on this call, and I know there's lots on this Zoom call, are please be more vocal. We know you're there, but we need your voices to be heard. So that's my plea. My question really is on this question of the motivation for Christian Zionism. Before the US election, I had a long discussion with somebody I used to work with who now lives in Washington, and he's on the left. And he was insistent that the motivation for Christian Zionists in the United States was this end times theory, that it's important for the second coming of the Messiah, the Christian Messiah, that the Jews are in control of Israel, and that when the Messiah comes, then the Jews can simply be dispensed with. And he was insistent that that's the motivation for Christian Zionism. Now I looked for statistics on, from opinion polls on the motivations for Christian Zionism, and I couldn't find anything. Tony, in your opinion, what proportion of Christian Zionists are motivated by this end times motivation, as opposed to the genuine support for Israel? Is it possible to get a handle on that? Thank you.
I mean, do the two have to be opposite? I mean, I do believe in the end time scenarios, and I wouldn't deny that. But I think that with that, we also see the place for righteousness of Israel existing, standing for Israel and standing for Israel politically as well as theologically. So, yeah, there is an element of both. And I don't think, I mean, I guess, I am certainly a supporter of Israel, Christian Zionist. I also do believe that these events are leading to the second coming of Jesus, so I wouldn't deny that. So therefore, it's not my total motivation for supporting Israel, but it is part of it. I would say that. So you can't. I mean, I know that may be upsetting to some Jewish people, but it's there, so you can't get away from it.
And what happens to the Jews in Israel when the Christian Messiah does come? Can they then be dispensed with?
Dispensed with? Well, this is a big question. I mean, in the book of Zechariah, it says that they should look unto me whom they have pierced and mourn for him as for only son. So actually that is interpreted as a looking to Jesus and believing in Jesus, and that Jesus then brings the New World Order, if you like, the true New World Order, with Jews living in Jerusalem and Israel and the rest of the world under his rule. So it is actually a kind of a big change. It's not something which is worked out politically. It's a event in which God intervenes. But in the meantime, it's important for us that Israel exists, and that therefore we should support Israel's existence, that Israel has to be there, that Jerusalem is going to be this issue which will be on the agenda in the last days, and therefore we should support Israel's right to be in Jerusalem. John here.
Jonathan?
Can I say something?
So the Jews get converted at the end?
Bottom line, yes. I mean that would
I don't want to be converted. I'm happy as it is.
That's all right. I mean, if the literal interpretation of Zechariah 12, Matthew chapter 23 also is that a significant number will turn to Jesus. Now, I know that that's probably the thing which really upsets Jewish people, and you don't want me to say that, but I mean, that is, if you like, part of the program. But nevertheless, I mean, the passage in Romans actually implies that Christians should pray for and support Israel, whatever they believe, whether they're for or against. So it's not.
Is this next week, next year? When can we expect this to happen?
Well, we don't know the day or the hour. That's another issue. But the point, one of the things which we do see is that things are moving in that direction. We're seeing a whole lot of things happening in the world which tie in with Bible prophecy, including even the sort of coronavirus and the shutdown of society and so on. So we don't know the exact timetable, but we do see things working out in that way. The whole question of Iran and the nuclear issue also fits in with certain things involved in the war of Gog and Magog, Ezekiel 38. So
we should watch the news, right?
Yeah, you watch the news and read the Bible.
Okay. Well,
I can see your point, and I know some Jewish people say, well, your only motivation is trying to convert us. Well, I do believe that Jesus is the Messiah. I wouldn't deny that, but it's up to people to choose what they want to believe. And I believe that whatever happens, that the restoration of Israel is in the will of God, therefore we should support it. And I think that the people who are opposed to Israel are actually opposed to God's plan. So that's why we would stand against them. And we should inform ourselves politically on what's taking place as well, so we can make intelligent remarks, not just
God, I just pray for that.
tie everything up with Bible prophecy.
Okay, so there was somebody who said, may I speak, but I don't know who that person is.
Good question, Sharon, from Malcolm Powell.
Yeah, go on.
Okay. Malcolm Powell has stated, Tony, that he was attending a church service and was told not to use the Schofield Bible.
Yes.
Now, this is alarming to us because we're a little bit ignorant of it, but we understand that the Schofield Bible forms a large basis of the Christian Zionist philosophy. If it's being banned in this country, is this a movement that you feel is likely to grow? Or
It's possible. I mean, the Schofield Bible is not a translation. It has a lot of comments. So some would say that they don't agree with the comments, so don't use this Bible. I have to say, I've never actually read the Schofield Bible, so it's not been an influence upon me in my view, but I know that it has been quite influential, particularly in the United States.
that's right, that's right.
So I wouldn't, I mean, if it's banned, it's probably part of, I mean, there are a lot of churches which would want to ban you from saying anything about Israel, to be honest. And, you know, I get people writing into me all the time saying that, you know, we never hear anything about Israel in our church and we're not allowed really to speak on the kind of subjects you talk about. And it's just a non-issue. I think perhaps I should say that although I've talked about the pro and the anti, a majority of Christians probably are in the middle and don't have any view in any particular interest in the subject. So they wouldn't be like, you know, they have vast numbers of Christians who are anti-Israel and vast numbers who are pro. There's a large majority who are stuck in the middle with no interest. And a lot of the churches actually do, official churches want to suppress now this kind of view, which I've been putting forward. It's definitely not flavor of the month. And there are people who write to me say that I've been more or less banned from our church from saying anything on this subject. So yeah, it is a problem. And I see someone has put there, very true, Tony. That's Susan, who I know, yeah. Perhaps it's been your experience, Susan.
Okay, David, more questions?
There's no other questions. So I see a man, an attendee, Jim Rosser wants to unmute.
Who is that?
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, all I wanted to comment on was Jonathan's question and the way he framed it. So the way that you framed your question, Jonathan, was you said that is the motivation for Christian Zionists the end time because that's what we want to believe about, you know, Jesus coming again. Therefore, that sort of drives us down that road of Christian Zionism. And my response to that would be that it's not a motivation. It comes out of a natural reading of the scriptures. So if you take the Bible and you read it in a plain English or a plain, you know, whatever language you're reading it in a literal, historical, grammatical sense, in a way that you would read a normal book, you know, without trying to eisegesis. You know, eisegesis is when you read something into a piece of literature. What we try to do is we try to do exegesis, and we try to let the book speak for itself. And when you do that naturally, we believe that you come to the conclusions that we do about the Hebrew Christian scriptures, so that it does talk about all those things that the Christian church have ignored in the Old Testament. They say that all those prophecies that God spoke to Abraham and to David, you know, that David would have a throne going on into eternity. They say that that's now been absorbed into the Christian church. Well, no, it hasn't. If you do a plain reading of the Old Testament, you can't possibly come to that conclusion. So therefore, we fully believe that Jesus, well, when he comes back, he will rule from Jerusalem on David's throne. The Jews will be the premier nation on the earth once again, as predicted throughout the Old Testament. they will be the premier nation, and the Gentile nations will go up every year at the Feast of the Tabernacles, and they will look for a Jew who can take them up there because they have the favor of God. That is the plain teaching of the Old Testament. And that's how we come to those conclusions. It's all about the hermeneutic. It's all about having that correct, literal, historical, grammatical hermeneutic when you approach the scriptures and you let them speak to you. And what you try not to do is you try not to enthrone yourself over what the scriptures are trying to teach you.
But we won't be Jews anymore. We'll be converted.
No, you still be Jews.
You'll still be Jews.
But Christian Jews.
Believing Jews.
Oh,
You're still Jews. Jews is you will always be the children of Abraham. Nothing will ever change that.
That's Jim.
Going
That's my
on into eternity.
understanding. That's my understanding.
Going on into eternity, you will always, and that will never change throughout eternity. You will always be God's chosen race.
Amen. Completed Jews in the Messiah, Yeshua.
okay. I mean, one of the things I said in my talk was that, in the first century, the apostles actually had to be persuaded to go to the Gentiles. They were going, first of all, entirely to Jews. So the first church was entirely Jewish. So they didn't call themselves Christians even. They were just Jews that believed in Jesus. So it was not and many of them continued going to the synagogue as well. So it wasn't like a kind of a departure from being Jewish. It was someone said a completion. But coming back to what Jonathan said, I appreciate what he says and I understand it. But I do believe that whether Jewish people accept Jesus or reject him, that's their decision. The Christian church, the true Christian church, should have a love and a concern for Israel and the Jewish people. Should have repaid the debt that we have from the Jewish people, giving us the Bible, giving us our message of salvation, etc., with love and with kindness. The fact that the church has done the opposite is a shame on the church. Now, today we do have the opportunity to repay this debt by standing with the Jewish people today against anti-Semitism, standing against anti-Zionism and the hatred of Israel, which is a real factor in the world today. Maybe Jonathan can actually give us some leads into who to write to and what to do and how to do this, because say one of my problems at the moment is that I've got so much on my plate I don't have time to do half of what I need to do, let alone take on more things. But I think that we need to have
there's a lot. In 7 days' time, there's a film called The Present, which is a viciously anti-Israel film, which is shortlisted for one of the Oscars.
Oh yeah. Oh dear.
So there's not a lot we can do about that. But if it wins, then let's hear you condemn it.
Yeah. Okay.
So and this Professor Miller at Bristol, we need your help over that. We need you to be writing to the Vice Chancellor saying that he should be dismissed because he's an anti-Semite. Yeah. Every day there's issues, quite honestly.
Yeah.
So perhaps Jonathan, one of our problems is that we work within our own community. Ambrosine and I have tried to work with Barbara and Tony, and perhaps we should be reaching out a little bit outside of our own community. And Tony, hopefully then you will join us.
Yeah, sure.
So be on our mailing list for issues like writing and joining letters about the lecturer in Bristol and the film and so on that are coming up.
Yeah, and I guess so. Even from this meeting, you've got a list of people who've turned in, so maybe you could.
That's right. So we'll keep in touch with you, and
I'll put my Jonathan? Twitter name. Just follow me on Twitter. You'll see.
Okay.
Well, I think we should do this. I think we should join a little bit of our forces and work together on this. But David, where are you? There's another question.
Yeah, there's another question. There's a question, Tony, from Norman Olswanger, and we're going back to the Islamic situation. Norman asks, categorizing and summarizing what he's asking, is the rewriting of history making Jesus an Islamic prophet not a dual-edged sword here? And is it not being very, very devious? First of all, it'll undermine Christianity completely because he will become an Islamic prophet. And secondly, it will serve as a purpose to be anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish, in that they will become once again prophet killers because they kill Christ according to Islam.
Yes.
So what are your feelings on this? What are your comments on this?
Well, I mean, the fact is that in the Quran, Jesus is a prophet. He's the last prophet before before Muhammad. The Quran actually rewrites Bible stories. If you read the Quran, which I don't recommend you to do, but you find that it's full of Bible stories. I mean, Abraham goes to Ishmael, and the covenant goes to Ishmael, not to Isaac and the Jews. So you have this kind of rewriting of the Jewish side of the story. You have the rewriting of the Christian side as well. And it denies certain fundamentals of the Christian approach to Jesus, that he's the Son of God, that he died on the cross and rose from the dead. You have an alternative Jesus. He's going to come back this time as a sort of servant of Muhammad and Islamize the world and then wrap it up. So that's the sort of Quranic has a kind of end time speculation which brings Jesus in as well. So the Quran already has made another Jesus who is the prophet of Islam. Now, what's happening with Arafat saying that Jesus was a Palestinian prophet, a Palestinian shaheed and a martyr and so on, is really building on the Quranic approach and sort of aligning it with the sort of Christian anti-Semitic position that Jesus was killed by the Jews and was so on. So it is something which is anti-Christian and also anti-Jewish. And, you know, I've noticed that the Palestinian Media Watch has actually picked up on some of this thing and saying that the Jews have actually got to reclaim the Jewishness of Jesus because that's who he was. And the making Jesus into a Palestinian is part of the Palestinian rewrite of history to de-Judaize the land of Israel and the history of Israel. So that's is another issue. But yeah, basically the Quran does have Jesus as a prophet already, and it has a false picture of Jesus.
Well, Sharon, it looks like Tony's answered everybody. It's everybody's in awe.
All right.
Yes.
Well,
Okay, there's okay. So I think, Tony, it's a very heavy subject, and I'm hoping that we'll come back to it with more information and perhaps a couple more speakers to have debates about it. I think that the questions that were raised are quite in-depth questions that need more probing, especially this end of times issue that I know concern a lot of Jewish people. And I think we need to tease through that and try and understand it more. We've had two slightly differing views here on that. But what I do know at the moment is that the Christian Zionists are our great friends and stand with us. And we'd like to see more activity, joint activity, working together a little bit more to see if we can change the narrative that's creeping into our education system, into our politics, in fact, into our entire society. So what I want to ask people is, if you want to be in touch or to follow people on the chat line, put your Twitter feed there, put your email address, well, your email address I'll have, but put your Twitter feed there or your Facebook profile link on the chat line so other people can have a look at it. We'll leave it up there for a little bit so people can look at it and follow. You can follow us on @campaign4T on Twitter, and you can follow Eye on Antisemitism on Twitter. You just need to put those in, Campaign for Truth or Eye on Antisemitism. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow us on Facebook. And if you, I have your email addresses. If you do not want to be on a mailing list, you need to send me an email so I can take you off. Otherwise, I will add you all to a list, and we will share hopefully all the information that we have coming through so that you can join us and help raise this voice that we need. So I think I see I've got one more hand up here. David Baines. Would you like to unmute yourself and have one last question there?
But it's not so much a question as an observation.
Yeah.
I think it's really one of the things that what I've always understood about Judenhass, hatred of the Jew, is called the world's oldest hatred. But if you understand it in purely secular, humanistic terms, it actually makes no sense at all. If you look at it in the spiritual context, then it makes perfect sense, because of the promise that Hashem made to Avraham, through you, your descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. We have Satan, an enemy. And who would want to destroy that promise? The enemy, Satan himself. And we have to meet it in this sense, in this arguments against it, but we also have to remember that we are in not just a secular war of ideas, but a spiritual war. And that's the real point about this. And that there's the whole thing about, again, the conflict in Israel as well, at the same time, well, with Islam, looking as Islam is Israel, as far as as the Muslims are concerned, is Dar al-Harb, a house of war, not Dar al-Islam, which is a house of peace. So it was under the control of Islam, and therefore it must return to that, whatever been any way and by any means necessary. So in a sense, with peace in Israel itself, you know, you're talking about things that are irreconcilable, because we are, again, this is what I have, the problem I have trying to explain this to people in churches, is that we are actually in a spiritual war. And get that across to them, they will, in Christian churches, they will actually begin to understand, but they need that understanding before they do.
Okay. Do we have another hand there? No, that's your hand. I don't know where you found the hand. I've been looking for one. Okay, so I think, yeah, with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. And I hope we've started a conversation, because I know this is a difficult conversation. It's quite tough to question each other's belief in this way, and to try and make sense of it so that we can all live together in peace and look forward to a future in peace. So I'm hoping that we'll continue this conversation. We'll arrange more meetings on it, I think. So Tony, thank you so much. Thank you, and Barbara, for being our friends, for being with us, for giving us a space where other communities will not give us the space to hold our meetings. And I won't go into that now, but thank you so much. And God bless you all.
Yeah, God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Tony.
Tony.
Thank you.
Shalom Aleichem.
Shalom Aleichem.
Shalom.
Thank you, everyone.
Could I just say we're not able to save the chats? Is there a way that we can save the chat? Because all these links have been put on and you can't save any of them.
Okay.
Put them in file. Yes, we can do
We're
that.
going to save it.
I've done that.
And
you can normally save chats, but we can't.
Yeah,
save
I can't
these.
change it now. But what I'm going to do is we've saved it, and I'm going to put it online, and I will email it to everybody who's registered. How's that?
Right, thank you.
I'll send it out. I know that there was a section in the settings, and I apologize, I forgot to change it. And I should have done, because I know that that's where people get the information from. But I will do that. I'll email it to everybody. I will also put it on the Campaign for Truth and the Iron Anti-Semitism Facebook page. And maybe I won't, because it reveals people's information publicly. I'll email it to everybody. Okay.
I've saved it, Sharon.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, guys, I'll say good night and thank you again. And
Thank
I wish
you.
you all well in these difficult times. I hope everybody's
You too.
managing to get through, and we'll be out soon. Take
Tada.
care. I'm going.
Thank you. Shalom, shalom.
Tada and shalom.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Tony.
Very much.
Okay, hi, Linda.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, David.
It's a great pleasure.
Thank you. Bless you all.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Okay, so I'm going to go. Tony, take care. Love to Barbara.
Thank you.